Hello, I'm John Perry, and I'm joined by Representative Gary Glenn for Representative Gary Glenn Reports. Representative, it's nice to see you.
John, good to see you again, sir.
Welcome back. Busy time in Lansing this week. The last time we chatted, we talked about an April 13th meeting of the House Energy Committee, talking about the energy reform package we've chatted about several times in the past. You told me then it was going to be an all-day meeting, and literally it was an all-day meeting. It went on, what, about 11 hours?
Yeah, it started at 9:30 in the morning and ended about 8 o'clock that night. So I felt sorry for the folks that stayed around as long as they did, but it's obviously a very important issue about which a lot of people are passionate.
And certainly for the state and your district, too.
It is an issue which does evoke a lot of passion. There are major employers like Dow Chemical and Dow Corning in the district that I represent in Midland County. We also have the Bay City School District and the Bay Aranac Intermediate School Districts that are in the energy choice market, which means they've exercised the choice of having somebody other than Consumers Energy provide their electricity at significant savings. In fact, we have found out in recent weeks through these hearings that about 60% of the public schools in the state of Michigan—
And you heard from those districts on Monday.
Heard them on Monday, a lot of them. Are in the choice market, have chosen an alternative provider to Consumers or Detroit Edison, have saved tens of millions of dollars. The only reason the other 40% of public schools who are not in the choice market aren't is because they're not allowed to be because of this artificially imposed, arbitrary 10% cap. I think efforts to eliminate the choice market, to force everybody to go back to Consumers or Detroit Edison are not going to succeed. I'm to a point in the process after 4 months as Vice Chairman of the Energy Committee that it's my read at this time that move is not going to succeed. And so the question is, can we expand the choice market? And what I'm going to propose, and I have a Democratic co-sponsor from the city of Detroit, just one of the pieces of legislation, is going to be to allow every public school in Michigan to choose an alternative energy supplier if it will save the taxpayers money on purchase of electricity. Like the Clarkston School District in Oakland County says it saves $350,000 a year, which means that's 5 teachers. If they had to go back to Detroit Edison in Oakland County's case, they said they'd have to lay off 5 teachers. In the districts that I represent, you've got Bay City Schools and Bay Aranac Intermediate School District, but not the Midland School District, not Bullock Creek, not Pinconning, because they didn't get in under the cap. I want to see every public school district in the state be able to save taxpayers money and be able to keep the teachers that they have and be able to save even more money by being able to access a cheaper, reliable source of electricity if they can find it in the market. Other people are going to address legislation that would allow hospitals who are not in the cap to save money. What about our prisons? What about the state and all of its state buildings? These are all opportunities to save money. And on the other side of the equation and the issue, John, we're also seeing new information that really call into question whether or not the whole premise of some type of crisis is impending in terms of energy supply. The Midwest managers of energy called MISO, it's down in Indiana, and it's the regulatory agency that distributes energy throughout the Midwest, last year was predicting a 3,000 megawatt shortfall for Michigan. Now are predicting a 1,000 megawatt surplus. Plus, we have the ability to import into Michigan over the big power lines 3,000 megawatts from outside the state if we have to. And so even in the worst case scenario, this whole premise of some type of impending crisis, I think we see kind of evaporating before our eyes. And so I'm going to now be focusing my efforts at not trying to take choice away from the people who are lucky enough to have it now, but to expand it. And especially, at least to start, with entities that are funded by taxpayers, so that we, by getting cheaper electricity rates for those tax-funded entities, we're saving the taxpayer money, we're keeping our schools competitive, and hopefully can save taxpayers money across the board on just one thing, which is a major part of the budget.
When we look at the energy issue, even Republicans are talking about a number of plans, and there are a number of moving pieces here too. But suffice to say, one of those pieces, one of the major pieces, revolves around competition and choice.
Well, and that is the whole thing. I think we all know in every other aspect of life that when you have multiple providers of a commodity or a service, and then consumers are free to choose from multiple providers. Then those multiple providers have to compete with each other to give the best product at the best price. It's what's best for everybody. I started out needing to be convinced that that principle that we know works everywhere else in life doesn't work for some reason in the electricity market. But I'm becoming more convinced that it does. I do want to take the opportunity to express my thanks to the reliable energy service that's provided by Consumers Energy, to the philanthropic contributions they make to our communities. But that's not the issue that was before the Energy Committee. The Energy Committee was taking up the question of whether or not we should continue to allow people to shop around for cheaper electricity rates and save taxpayers money in the process. But if 60% of public schools in the state are able to save money, why can't the other 40%? Why can't all public schools save their patrons money? And then, of course, we haven't even touched on the private sector. Dow Chemical was there to testify. Walmart was there to testify, because these major energy consumers, it is a big deal to major energy consumers like Dow Chemical how much they spend on electricity. It is a factor which determines whether or not Dow keeps operations in Midland or sends them to Houston. It's a factor in whether or not new operations are built in Midland or in Houston or in Indonesia or anywhere else around the world that Dow Chemical may have operations. So it is a key factor, just like making Michigan a right-to-work state, adjusting our tax policy, energy costs. In fact, Andrew Liveris gave a speech about a month ago. I was in attendance. He said, we're going to continue to have operations in Midland because it's our heritage. We're proud of that heritage. But if you want to know why you're not getting some of the new facilities that are going to Houston, give us more competitive electricity rates and you'll get them. That was all he said, but I got the message. And I'm doing my best to carry that message as Vice Chairman of the Energy Committee.
You are Vice Chairman. The role of that type of committee is for individuals, entity, to come to Lansing, to testify. But as a lawmaker, your role is to ask questions. So along those lines, as various entities came up to testify, what kinds of things? Obviously, choice competition are at the top of your list. But what kind of things were you asking about?
Well, the very kinds of things I've just been discussing. I was asking, is it true? I was probing, pressing. Is it true there's going to be a shortfall? Is it true there's going to be some kind of calamity and crisis? I didn't see the evidence of that, and I did my best to flush that out. And as new evidence comes out, we've had studies and analyses that have come out just in the last several days which indicate that there's not this doomsday scenario we've been being told for the last 4 months was driving the entire debate and trying to make us believe that choice and competition doesn't work in this market like it does in every other market. So I think the evidence as it comes out is bolstering our case. And then I was interested in hearing and probed those who were in favor of maintaining the choice market. You know, what have been the benefits to you? Give us the dollar amounts. How much has your school district saved? And we found, John, we didn't even know 3 months ago about public schools being in the choice market, and now we find out that about 60% of the public schools in the state are.
And so, you heard from folks all over the state along those lines.
We had the Howell,
Kalamazoo.
We had Kalamazoo said they've saved $1 million. We had Clarkston say they've saved $350,000 a year. The Howell Public Schools, Gibraltar Public Schools, in my district, Bay City Public Schools and Bay Aranac Intermediate School District. So school districts all across the state. And so the first place we're going to look to expand this is to our schools. Schools have certainly felt some tightening of funding. We're going to try to change that in the upcoming budget. But this is just another way that we can provide more operating capital for our schools, give Midland Public Schools and Bullock Creek and Penn Canning and some of those an opportunity, Meridian Schools the opportunity to also access energy choice. So then we had a hearing a few days after that where the Public Service Commission testified, and my line of questioning there was, instead of allowing the utilities, the self-interested parties, to self-assess the needs for our electricity in the future and self-initiate the process of new electricity generation, that the Public Service Commission should be the one that acts as an honest broker on behalf of the taxpayers and ratepayers of Michigan, that they, like is the case in some other states, should be the ones that determine when new electricity capacity is needed and then put it out to a competitive bid process. Let the major utilities bid on it, but not give them the presumptive favorable position. Let them bid on it like anybody else. Let Midland Cogeneration Venture bid on it. If I understand it, Midland Cogeneration Venture, which is the largest gas-fired electricity and steam producing plant in the United States, located in Midland, I understand they're only operating at half capacity. They'd like to be able to bid on new capacity if new capacity is needed. So I'm going to continue to steer things as best I can as Vice Chairman of the Energy Committee toward a free market, competition, and choice model. Ohio has an open and competitive model. They have 6 new plants right now in the process of either being built, shovels in the ground, or in the permitting and planning and zoning stage. And that's a competition market. There's no guarantee, no monopoly. There's no need by investors to know that they've got a certain, like, for example, the major utilities in Michigan right now have a guaranteed 90% of the base. Only 10% can choose an alternative. The other 90% have to get their energy from consumers and from Detroit Edison. And even that has not been enough to stimulate the building of new energy plants in Michigan, while next door neighbor, open market, competitive market Ohio has 6 new plants being built for new capacity. So that's the kind of evidence that's coming out. It's a complex issue, but I asked for the job, and I've had to study to be able to keep up with it, but I asked for the job because it is so important. It is such a major factor for the major employers like Dow Chemical, Dow Corning, Midland Cogeneration Venture, Hemlock Semiconductors that are in my district or that employ residents of our district.
In the Energy Policy Committee, you were talking and asking questions. And tax policy, the Tax Policy Committee this week, you were the one who was presenting legislation and answering some questions. We've talked earlier about your legislation dealing with the mega tax credits that were issued in what we call the lost decade, and the impact that they're having now in 2015 on the state budget, and the impact they're going to have out until 2032.
Yeah.
So, in other words, about a decade and a half. It's your first bill. Clearly, it's moving forward.
Well, I'm a member of the Tax Committee, so I had the opportunity for the first time to testify in front of one of the committees on which I serve, and it wasn't that difficult. I mean, it certainly wasn't as difficult as energy policy was. It was pretty simple. It simply said that any contract between the state of Michigan and an employer like the Big Three or Dow Chemical, by which they would earn tax credits by either creating new jobs or, in the time of the economic downturn, just keeping the jobs that we have in Michigan, that any of those contracts cannot be renegotiated so as to increase the liability on the taxpayers of Michigan. We've got $9 billion hanging out there. We were caught unawares at the end of the year, and I was a freshman just coming in as this happened. But we had to, in the first several weeks we were in the new legislative session, had to actually go in the middle of the year's budget and make cuts because the tax credits were turned in. They were not anticipated. That's got to change. But this is not meant to disparage in any way the major employers who earn those tax credits, who met their obligation under the contract.
It is a contract.
It is a contract. We have to honor it. But we've got to reassure taxpayers of Michigan and potential investors around the country and the world who look to a state and its fiscal management reliability and stability. We've got to convince both that we've got the house in order, our act together, that we can manage these things and don't get hit unawares like we did. That means we need to have legislation that forces the Department of Treasury to tell the legislative budget-setting policy-making body about this earlier than they did in this particular instance. But it's kind of a pause. We're hitting a pause button. We're freezing this process in place until we're sure we've got the mechanism changed to where we don't get hit unawares again with another $500 million shortfall that we weren't anticipating, and suddenly in the middle of a budget year have to make cuts again. So that's the purpose of the bill. I think it's going to pass. I mean, I think it's going to pass not just the committee. I think it'll pass the House. I think it's going to pass the Senate. It pretty much, very simply, codifies Governor Snyder's policy right now. So I do believe this is going to be a bill that's going to become law. It may not become law. The chairman of the Tax Policy Committee instructed me that after you sponsor a bill, that's the point at which any control over the process you have ends. So it's subject to committee amendment. I'm totally open to that. I met with Democratic Representative Jim Townsend. I'm going to be meeting, by the time this airs, it will have already occurred as well with one of the Senate or House leaders on the Democratic side, because we're working on this on a strictly nonpartisan basis. There's no Republican-Democrat divide on this issue. We just want to make sure we don't increase the liability to Michigan taxpayers. And I've been very gratified to find that there's no partisan posturing on this issue. That happens in Lansing. We're in a political environment, but on this issue, there's none of that I have detected. There's just a sincere desire to make sure this mechanism is fixed.
Okay, Representative, we're going to take a break right now, and we'll be back momentarily with Representative Gary Glenn Reports. And we're back with Representative Gary Glenn Reports. Representative, even when we were talking about energy policy, we were chatting about school funding. It's a huge issue. Along those lines, legislatively, you're working on what? 4 bills right now dealing with the school funding issue?
Yes, and have met recently twice with Midland Public Schools Superintendent Mike Sharrow and with Midland Public School Board President Gerald Wasserman. I've attended meetings of the Meridian School Board and also the Pinconning School Board, Midland School Board. In fact, briefly testified in front of the Midland School Board. And I think by the time this is broadcast, that I will also have attended Bullock Creek School Board meeting. But in particular, regarding the Midland Public Schools, Midland's one of those districts that a quarter a century ago, when Proposal A was passed, has since been characterized as a privileged or hold harmless district. I'm not going to get into the weeds of what all those terms mean, but what it means practically is, for example, just one issue, there is a pot of money in the state budget for education, in the school aid fund, for underprivileged kids, for at-need or at-risk needs-driven children. And even though we're one of the more affluent communities here in Midland in the state of Michigan, 27% of the students in the Midland Public School System meet the criteria for being at risk, the school lunch program, that kind of thing. And yet, because Midland is one of these privileged districts, and that seems to be an unusual term in terms of what we're talking about, no child in the Midland Public School District gets any of that money that has been targeted for at-risk children, because the districts are measured, not the child. And my approach to this is going to be legislatively, and I give Jerry Wasserman credit for framing it this way, and Mike Sharrow for coming up with a good way, I think a very shorthanded way of describing it, is that children are at risk, not districts. We may have an above average district. We certainly do in terms of performance, quality of life, quality of instruction, and that type of thing. But that doesn't mean we don't have children in our community who are in need of help. So if we're going to allocate this money, I believe it ought to follow the child, not be allocated by district. And there are about 10% of the districts across the state of Michigan who don't get any of this money, even though they also have, in the case of Midland Public Schools, 1 out of every 4 children, over 1 out of 4. So if this legislation were to succeed, then the Midland Public School District would get more money because it would, for the first time, get money for its at-risk students. So that's one thing, and I give Jerry Wasserman credit for bringing that to my attention, and I was happy to pursue it. I've also introduced legislation, and I had 25 co-sponsors, to repeal the prevailing wage requirements on all new public school construction. The estimate is we'd save $223 million a year. That's enough money to have spent on building 100 new elementary schools over the last 10 years. 300 new elementary schools is the figure. So that would make it cheaper for Midland and all the school districts that I represent to construct new buildings. And I think the newest building in the Midland Public Schools District, where I live, is 50 or 60 years old. I mean, that's the newest one in one of the more, above average districts across the state. Also, as I've already mentioned, legislation to allow all school districts to buy cheaper energy from a provider other than Consumers Energy. And if you can save, like the Clarkston School District did, $350,000 a year, any school district that is not currently in the choice market for electricity purchases, if we can save them that much more money, that's more money to go toward children. Just as with repealing the prevailing wage law, which requires that an inflated union scale wage rate and benefits package that's set in Flint or Detroit has to be paid to construct a new school in Pinconning. That doesn't make sense. We'd save money that would, instead of going to put up the bricks and mortar of the classroom, that could be redirected to the children in the classroom. And then finally, one that, and this one at first blush you may not think of in terms of financing, but let me explain why I put it in that context. A bill that says, for example, if a retired Dow chemist goes to the local school board and says, as a contribution to my community, I'm willing, after 40 years as a chemist at one of the leading chemical companies in the world, I'm willing to teach chemistry at Midland High or Meridian High or Dow High School, wherever, Bay City Western. I'm willing to teach, no charge to the district. And the local principal and school board and superintendents judge this person not just to know their subject matter, but to be qualified to teach. And I trust our local school officials to be able to make a rational judgment based on interviewing and watching how they might interact with children. But if they're willing to do that in a paid position or in a strictly volunteer position, that they ought to be free to make that judgment and to hire that person and save money if it's done on a voluntary basis without that person having necessarily gone through all the schooling to get a teacher's certificate. Because the bottom line is we ought to be focused on educating the children. If they can benefit from a retired Dow chemist who wants to give back to his community, that ought to be our focus. And if he's willing to do it free of charge, why should the state impose barriers that don't let a local school board take advantage of that type of opportunity? So that may not happen every day. I see it as in general, a local control posture and policy, but also one that might end up saving taxpayers' money and school districts' money if you have people who would be willing to spend an hour a day or all day as a volunteer teacher because of their life experience, that they can offer something of value to our students in our school district, and let the local school officials, not the politicians in Lansing, decide who is and is not qualified to teach. I trust Jerry Wasserman and the Midland Public School Board and Mike Sharrow, the superintendent, and Mike View up in Pinconning, and the superintendents and principals and local school officials to make a better judgment. They're in the schools every day. They focus just on that one issue. As a legislator, I got to focus on hundreds of issues. Who should be deciding who's qualified to teach in a classroom at Midland High? Me or Mike Sharrow? I think the answer to that is pretty obvious. I don't think just because I got a few more votes than my Democratic opponent last November that makes me smarter or than our local school board on this kind of question. So I've communicated this to our school officials that I am very serious about looking for ways to return control of this process to our local school boards, local principals, local superintendents, and not have it all dictated from Lansing. So those are 4 different policies that one way or another I think can relieve some of the financial burden on our public schools.
Now, you referenced the state budget. It's budget time in Lansing under the timetable lawmakers have been working on since 2011. The idea is to have the budget for the 2016 fiscal year,
right,
which doesn't begin until the 1st of October, completed around the 1st of June. However, when you're talking about a budget that spends north of $50 billion, clearly you have your work cut out.
Well, I'm a freshman, but I've been told by those who've been here more than 4 months that this has been the most transparent process of the budget and has been the process by which the entire House of Representatives, the Republican caucus, has been advised of what's in every budget, not just piled into one big one and put before us and said vote yes or no on this thing you haven't even had time to read. We spent 4 hours one day a week or so ago, and then 3 hours the next day being briefed by each of the appropriations subcommittee chairs on their budgets and where we cut and where we increased and how the money was allocated with the rules that were going to be attached to it and that type of thing. And I'm told that has been the most transparent, comprehensive process of making sure every member of the House, not just those on the Appropriations Committee, know what they're doing when they cast a vote on the budget. So we're making government operate more efficiently. You know, before Governor Snyder, the budgets might not be done until October or later. Governor Snyder has maintained a record, and the Republican-led legislature, of reducing a budget by June 1st. Each of now, this would be the 5th year. And I think we're going to meet that again. So I'm happy to have had the benefit of a very comprehensive and transparent budget process. And we were able to get the question of this at-risk money that I've discussed earlier taken up in the process at the appropriate time, and we didn't miss the window of opportunity. So an amendment to the budget, the K-12 budget, I expect is going to, perhaps by the time we're broadcast, have already been taken up by the Appropriations Committee, and I'm going to be asking them to change the allocation of the money as we described earlier, so that that at-risk money follows the child, including the 27% of students in the Midland Public School District, which of the 7 school districts I represent right now gets none of that money. I think they ought to.
Representative, you're being honored this spring for a lifetime of work on the right to work issue. Tell me about that.
Well, the National Right to Work Committee Board of Directors called me a few weeks ago, and I attended their Board of Directors meeting in Omaha, Nebraska here a week or so ago, and received the Legislator of the Year award, which in my case, you might wonder how's a guy that's only been there 4 months get that kind of award. But in my case, it was intended as a lifetime achievement award type of thing. I'm very honored. It's a principle about which I have felt very strongly throughout my entire adult life, simply that an individual should be free in Michigan, I believe in the entire United States of America, should be free to join a union, should be free to financially support a union, should be free to organize a union, vote for certifying a union, but should not be forced to join or pay dues or in any way financially support a labor union under threat of being fired as a condition of employment. It's an individual freedom issue for me. It's a rights of conscience in the workplace issue for me. It also happens to be an element that outside investors look to in a state and is a major attraction for new investment, new business and industry. I'm proud to report to you, John, that in the first full year that Michigan had its right to work law in effect, we catapulted to #1 in the nation in new manufacturing job growth. 25,000 new jobs in the first year we were a right to work state. Guess which state was #2 in the nation? The other state that passed right to work in 2012 was Indiana. Think of the competitive disadvantage we'd still be at vis-a-vis Indiana if they had passed it and we hadn't. Now Wisconsin has joined us, so we have 3 Midwestern right-to-work states.
And these are states, excuse me, Representative, that people commonly identify as being in the Rust Belt.
Well, absolutely, and big labor states, and more power to them. I mean, Michigan citizens have a right to be proud of their role historically in the history of organized labor, the creation of the middle class, et cetera. But I remember Samuel Gompers was quoted as saying that voluntarism was the bedrock keystone of Americans' labor movement. Volunteerism, not compulsion. So that's the principle of right to work. You're free to choose to join, not join, free to financially support, choose not to. You can't be fired, can't be penalized, discriminated against either way. And that's a principle about which I have felt strongly. I led the campaign back 30 years ago to pass a right to work law in the state of Idaho. Have lived now in Michigan 16 years or so, and was a founding board member of the Michigan Freedom to Work Coalition, which launched the successful, miraculous effort to make Michigan a right-to-work state back in 2012. So, and worked in other states, Louisiana, New Hampshire, New Mexico, back in the 1980s.
Thank you very much.
You bet. Thank you, sir.
And I'm John Perry. Thank you for joining us.